So thank you for joining us. My name is Erika Sánchez, and I work as a multimedia producer at American Bird Conservancy, which is a nonprofit dedicated to conserving wild birds and their habitats in the Americas. I'm joined by my colleagues Naamal de Silva, who is the Vice President of our Together for Birds program, and Madeline Duffy, who is our social media specialist. And we also have Esmeralda Bravo, who is the Road to Recovery International Fellow and has actually also led discussions on this very topic. I will be switching back and forth between English and Spanish during this first part of the presentation. But if anyone needs interpretation throughout, just let me know in the chat. Muy buenas tardes, gracias por acompañarnos. Mi nombre es Erika Sánchez y trabajo como productora de contenido multimediático en American Bird Conservancy, que es una organización dedicada a conservar las aves y sus hábitats en el continente americano. Me acompañan hoy mis colegas Naamal de Silva, vicepresidenta de Juntos por las Aves, y Madeline Duffy, especialista de medios sociales. También tenemos a Esmeralda Bravo, que es la Road to Recovery International Fellow, y ha dirigido también discusiones sobre este tema en otras plataformas. Algunas logísticas antes de empezar. Durante esta primera parte voy a presentar en español y en inglés, pero si alguien necesita interpretación durante el resto del coloquio, por favor nos dejan saber en el chat. Y también les invitamos a participar en la conversación activando su cámara y su micrófono o utilizando el chat. Hoy vamos a estar abriendo un diálogo sobre el futuro de la conservación, utilizando como punto de partida el artículo Ornitología Neotropical, reconsiderando supuestos históricos, eliminando barreras sistemáticas y reimaginando el futuro, que fue escrito por más de 100 autores y ha causado mucha discusión en el mundo de la ornitología y la conservación de aves. Eliza lo compartió el link en el chat, así que lo pueden ver ahí. Today, we will be opening a dialogue about the future of conservation using as a starting point the article Neotropical Ornithology, Reckoning with Historical Assumptions, Removing Systemic Barriers and Reimagining the Future, which was authored by more than 100 authors from Latin America and the Caribbean and has caused a lot of discussion in the field of ornithology and bird conservation. And Eliza just shared the article a little bit earlier, and you can find it there. So as a quick summary, this article lays out how research by ornithologists in Latin America and the Caribbean has been systematically excluded from global scientific paradigms. This includes not being considered for publication in major scientific journals, research being rarely cited, and a lack of participation in establishing research priorities, among other points. En resumen, el artículo discute la exclusión sistemática de los ornitólogos en América Latina y el Caribe de paradigmas científicos globales. Esto incluye la omisión de sus perspectivas en publicaciones científicas globales, sesgo de citación que favorece a autores del norte global y falta de participación en el establecimiento de prioridades de investigación. Algunas de las barreras que mencionaron en el artículo son la dominancia de la perspectiva del norte global, y esto incluye narrativas de descubrimiento que centran a investigadores extranjeros descubriendo lo desconocido. La ciencia paracaidista, que era un término nuevo para mí, pero es cuando extranjeros dirigen proyectos en la región sin incluir investigadores locales en su autoría, la planificación o toma de decisiones, la hegemonía del inglés y financiamiento limitado para las investigaciones. Ellos sugieren algunas soluciones, entre ellas invertir directamente en investigaciones de campo, fomentar el liderazgo colectivo y aprendizaje recíproco y fortalecer oportunidades de financiamiento y desarrollo profesional. Let me go back to the English. So some of the barriers that the article lists are the dominance of the northern lens, which includes discovery narratives centered on foreign researchers that discover the unknown, parachute science, which is when foreigners lead projects without local researchers in authorship, planning, and decision-making roles, language hegemony of English, and limited access to funding. So a lot of these points, obviously, they were centered on the field of ornithology, but we think a lot of it is applicable to conservation and to other fields as well. A lot of it I related to having come from even the education field. So now we'll open it up. So the first question we have for you, and I'll stop my screen sharing for my colleagues at ABC, but also for anyone who's listening. What resonated with you from the article, or even from, if you haven't been able to read it, from these points that I just summarized?
So I could go ahead. And for me, going to the very beginning of this article, one of the, as there's a lot of very important points throughout the article, but one of the things that um, I found most powerful is that there are about 100 authors. And when you are thinking about systemic problems of exclusion, of voices that have been marginalized or intentionally excluded or just forgotten about in the research discourses, having that many authors representing so many different institutions and so many different countries throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, it is an incredibly powerful way to create that space for further dialogue and possibilities and better collaboration and reciprocity in the future. It seems like a simple thing, but in academia, there is so much searching for credit and creating your own something that is unique or new or entirely your own. And so, first authorship or sole author articles are a big deal. And so, to have 100 authors on a single article in a major English publication, where you're talking about Spanish language or Portuguese or other languages and naming the barriers, I think is an incredibly powerful thing. So, my question has to do for all of you who are in the audience, and please feel free to just add ideas in the chat and questions for us about this article, about barriers to entry to conservation careers, to birding, to habitat conservation, or to academic research. Please put that all in the chat. And I'd love to hear points from Madeline and Esmeralda. Eliza, your perspective is always welcome as well. But my question has to do with what is an example from your own personal experience where having a diverse set of perspectives in the room allowed you to make some concrete change, or where a multi-institutional or multi-stakeholder project or initiative was able to do something exciting to expand, to break down a barrier, to create space for more justice-oriented conservation, and anything along those lines. I'd love to hear those stories and perspectives.
I would like to share my experience as international fellow, because I have been included in this initiative where the most exciting part for me about being part of this initiative is that it has the idea to include, for example, other sectors like social science into the recovery of species. And as someone who has lived and worked in Latin America, I can see that even the social science can have a different approach in different countries. So having these diverse perspectives also help a lot when we are constructing or when we are planning the recovery plans or proposing recovery action for the species, because every country has their own context and background and challenge, and all relied into the social context, social and economic context. And I think in Latin America and the Caribbean, it's very difficult to separate the things, like to separate that people live in those protected areas maybe, and they are using the resources. So having these diverse perspectives can make the recovery of the species a sustainable project, right? Like if we integrate all the challenge, all the ideas, and all that is needed for all these sectors, I think that gives us the vision to have this. How can make these projects work and stay together in the future?
I'll read it out loud, and then Maddie, maybe you can go as well to share your insights. I've been in the bird conservation field a long time now, and throughout that have dealt with a lot of closed doors and gatekeeping that felt to me were due to our resistance to make space for people who don't fit a specific profile in terms of academic background, personal history, cultural perspective, way of speaking, a lot of these things associated with one's race, ethnicity, class, and the experiences these come with, etc. Yes, definitely. Thank you for sharing, Lucila. Madeline, would you like to go?
Yeah, thank you, Lucila. That kind of ties perfectly into what I found most powerful about this article, which is it really did an excellent job of disentangling how entangled the field of conservation is with the legacies of colonialism and imperialism. And as you point out, it's from the top down, it's all the way through. It's part of how we work. It's part of how we publish. It's part of our collaborations. And part of our work now is to try and separate and criticize and move forward in a new and different way that is more just. And so one of the questions that they bring up in the article is what even counts as bird research? That's something that Lucila touched on, what type of knowledge is valued in our conservation spaces, right? And then for me, that makes me think of how imperialism and colonialism are not just sort of the historical movement of people taking land, of people occupying places, but it can be something that's multi-pronged, that operates in many different ways. And recently I was at a conference with Linda Tuhiwau Smith, and speaking of that interdisciplinary element, Esmeralda, where she defined imperialism as having 5 different expressions. And I think that's very powerful. So there's the expression that we think about where imperialism is that colonization, but then it's also economic expansion, which affects our research and our fieldwork. It is the subjugation of an other, which affects our research and our fieldwork. It is an idea and a spirit that manifests in all these forms. And it is that field of knowledge. The Western science is a form of imperialism. And so my question for everyone to sort of mull over, and I'd love, again, put it in the chat, respond by unmuting in English or Spanish. How do these patterns shape the question we ask? How does this legacy of colonialism, of imperialism shape the kinds of questions we're asking, who we work with and where, and what our industry views as success? And so I'll stick that question in the chat in English and Spanish, and please, anyone chime in.
If I could jump in, I think that Lucila's most recent comment links very closely to what you're talking about, Maddie, with there are these patterns of exclusion or marginalization, and we talk about them in spaces like this. Naturally Latinos is a space where we talk about justice-oriented issues, equity-oriented issues, but does that impact the leadership of conservation organizations or research institutions, or even more relevant, perhaps, the donors that fund those research institutions and nonprofits and government agencies? And that's a tough question, right? It is. I do feel like I work in various different spaces. Some spaces where it's a given, and some spaces where these barriers are not necessarily that visible. And I'd love to hear perspectives of those people attending this session about that. But at ABC, we have been trying to have these sorts of conversations in multiple spaces. This is the very first of a Future of Conservation series of discussions that we want to have in pretty much every space where we work over the course of the year. We're turning 30 as an organization this year. And so any questions or comments or ideas that you all have for future conversations on how to make the field of biodiversity conservation or bird conservation or ornithological research more inclusive and just and ethical, those conversations and those questions are really valuable. And I would love for us to take your questions and ideas back to ABC's leadership, but also the leadership of some of our partner institutions. Other thoughts from any of you, Esmeralda, Erica, Maddie? There's so much in this article. And oh yes, Erica put in the chat the next conversation in this same series, which is with Planet Forward, and it's focused on students, undergraduates and graduate students. So please share that as well. On the role of fellowships, that webinar will also kick off our Conservation and Justice Fellowship program for this year. We have a bunch of new projects on things like discovery narratives and questioning those in relation to our Lost Birds program. I think that one's particularly relevant to this article and this topic, but a range of other topics too, including likely we will have one on cross-border conservation, Mexico and the US border in the Sonoran Desert.
I want to add to one of the comments from Lucila on discussion of these types of articles and action from it. And I guess one of the experiences that I've had is a philosophical alignment. Oh, sorry. What happened, Naamal?
Can't hear you, Erica.
Oh, really?
You were sort of going on and off mute for some reason.
Okay. Oh, that's weird. One of the experiences I've had is a philosophical alignment of like, yes, this is good. This is a good idea. Let's consider this, but then not taking it to the next step, which is actually doing something about it, or just kind of that follow through that I think is a challenge for many spaces.
Absolutely. In response kind of to Lucila's question, and then also thank you so much, Lucila, for sharing your experience. Anyone can go and read that information about the letter in the chat. Absolutely. Letters like that are important. We might not feel like our voices are being heard, but we're saying things, right? And as Erica said, like we can sometimes it starts with just getting people on board with the idea. Another thing is that, we're all here and we're all in the spaces where we're working, and it's not enough, but as far as getting people to listen and to get on board with this work, we're all able to kind of infiltrate these systems and say, I'm going to change the way I do my work. I'm going to prioritize community involvement. I'm going to cite sources that are primary sources with linguistic diversity that are from the people who are doing the work, rather than a secondary source that is from, some white guy in a northern university, right? Like we can implement that work, and the large scale structural institutional changes are needed. But the personal changes that we make in our own practice matter as well.
Very much agree. And also, I think slowing things down is sometimes using those questions and those different ways of working to slow down some of the processes of research or project management can be helpful too, because a lot of these barriers have to do with who's in the room or not in the room, who's leading the discussion or not leading the discussion. And if you want to diversify or expand all of that, you need time for outreach and relationship building and trust building. Slowing down is so important, but there's so much pressure to do things very quickly. Species are going extinct, habitats being destroyed, the sea levels rising. There's such urgency, and yet taking more time is how you build sustainability into projects, whether it is for conservation or for environmental or social justice.
Absolutely. Our timelines being so quick and like following along with publishing cycles and with grant cycles. This is again one of those things that's wrapped up in colonialism, imperialism, Western science, and slowing down can be a sort of radical act of decolonizing your own workflow and saying, I'm going to do this in an intentional way. When we talk about the need to collaborate more with communities, especially local communities, one of the things that researchers and practitioners run into is that it's difficult to build partnerships within a grant cycle, right? Where we have these things imposed where it's like, yes, I want to take the time to build these relationships, but I need to spend my money by Q4. And so how do I make this work? And I think part of, again, that this work that we're doing is being able to say, maybe I build the relationship first. Maybe it takes several years and it feels uncomfy, but that's okay. We build the relationships. We work from the ground up. We develop the grant proposal together instead of approaching the community after I've received funding. And we carry on this work. And it doesn't line up with my need to like get published. It's a different way of working, but we need to sort of deconstruct, again, the way we look at success in this work in order to truly collaborate in the way that we all recognize that we need to.
Esmeralda, do you want to add to that at all in terms of community engagement and those partnership building exercises, since that is the focus of your entire fellowship work?
It is. And I was thinking a lot of what Madeline was saying because, there is this urgency and like, we need to make those collaborations and we need to find the partners, but sometimes it seems like the partnership is gonna build like in one night, and the trust is always about trust, and the trust doesn't build in one night, right? You have to build the partners, know the strengths, our own strengths, and yes, and knowledge and capacities, and to build that trust. And sometimes that means to invest money and time that do not correspond that may not correspond to our direct objectives or for the project, right? And it has to, but in the future, it's like we still don't know. I think that we don't still give that value that in the future that partnership will have, or the trust that it will at the end happen, and will make the project just going by itself because of that partnership was so strong and was really strong base from the beginning. And I like to and for example, just like showing up, right? Showing up with your partners, showing up in their local activities or in those activities that are important for them and as well as are important for you. It's like building like any relationship with trust and care, right? Care genuinely about the partner you are trying to connect.
I want to call out Lucia's comment in the chat. They say there seems to always be a rush to complete a research project or general project, but then actually publishing that information and spreading the word takes forever. This is another thing, Lucia, that's addressed in the article. The fact that so often our work and our research is extractive, and we take the information and we take it like away physically, and we publish it in a language that the community doesn't speak, behind a paywall they can't access. Like there's so many ways in which we take the information from a community. And that's another one of these ways where us, the practitioners, without being like the higher ups, can have a commitment to sharing the information that we collect back with our source communities. And that's something that we really need to be dedicated to doing if we're going to conduct research in a very just way and share that information.
Thank you, Maddie. Erica, do you have anything to add before we close out the session?
Just that what you both were saying applies very much to us as communicators as well, and how we produce the content that tells the stories of the people that we work with and the places that we work at.
Yeah, there's so much power in who tells a story, how they tell that story. And so thinking about communications in relation to all of this work is also so valuable. And I think to wrap us up, I don't know if we can copy the chat. Can we copy the chat? There's so much good feedback in there. But I found that this quick session has still been really helpful. Please be in touch with us on LinkedIn or via email. We'd love to continue this conversation. And also just to highlight the ideas around reciprocity, returning information back to the community to avoid those extractive relationships. I think it really does come down to reciprocal and trusting relationships as a takeaway from this. And thank you so much to all of you for joining us. Muchas gracias.